My name is Moritz Stefaner, and the title of my talk is Finding Truth and Beauty in Data, because this is pretty much what I'm concerned with on a daily basis. And I'd just like to give you a few glimpses into my work, what I do, how I do it, and what I find important in the next 20 minutes or so. Maybe a little bit of background so you get a bit where I'm coming from. So I bring in a funny mix in a way. So I have some experience from working in web agencies during the first .com bubble, and I have a lot of practical experience from that time. I then proceeded to study cognitive science to understand how the mind works and how the brain works and how we can understand a bit better how we represent and understand information. And I studied that, and so I did my bachelor's there in a hard science discipline, if you want. But then proceeded to study interface design in Potsdam, which is a design degree, so I did that for my master's. Did some work as a research assistant there, and for the last 8 years or so, I'm almost exclusively concerned with data visualization. In the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working as an independent consultant in the field. And yeah, I'll just like to show you a bit of my world. So essentially, we're dealing with turning information into pictures, right? I mean, that's an old craft, if you think about it. The first maps go back to 6,000 before Christ, even predated, of course, by the first cave paintings. And we have also great works, let's say, from the 19th century, which was often called the golden age of infographics. So some of you might be familiar with Charles Minard's depiction of Napoleon's march against Moscow. And also, many of the diagrams you might know from office software today have their origin in the 19th century. So here we have the first pie chart of the world, probably 1801 from William Playfair. And you know, at that time, graphics were mostly used, they were hand-created, and they were used with the goal of communicating ideas or knowledge, or helping us think, right? So if you sit down and take a pen and scribble, you can externalize what you have in your mind, and this can help you to think. And these are still two very important cases or use cases for diagrams. But a seminal moment, of course, was the advent of computer systems. And now we could create images by using computer code and automatically processing information to create images. And this sort of changes everything from my perspective, because now we can explore large data sets using a new device, a new type of glasses, if you want, a new way of looking at the world. And we can now deal with data interfaces that go much beyond what we can see with our normal eyes. So that's John Tukey, who sort of founded that field of exploratory data analysis in the beginning of the 70s. And also from the 70s, there's this idea that, you know, microscopes, they allow us to see the very small things and, you know, extend our eyes into the very small. And telescopes, they help us reach like to the stars and see what's very far. And now we need sort of macroscopes, which are new types of devices that help us understand complexity and complex systems, society as a whole, culture, these types of things. And I think data visualization can play that role and help us explore worlds that would otherwise be totally inaccessible to our eyes. And I sort of like to think that these sorts of new perspectives on all these kinds of worlds, you know, the world of finance, the world of knowledge, the world of social interaction, the world of communication, seeing all of that from above can lead to something like a new overview effect. You know, when the first astronauts, when they flew into space, the idea was to explore the moon, you know, and we thought the most exciting thing is to see the moon from close. But the most fascinating thing was to look back and see the world from above, right, and see it's one big coherent thing. And when you're in the middle of it, you don't see anything. You don't see the big patterns. You don't see that it's actually one coherent organism. But once you're able to elevate yourself and see it from above, you have this type of kind of awe and these profound insights. And data visualization can today play exactly this role also for the non-physical worlds. So as I said, I'll just show you some of my work because this is obviously what I'm most familiar with. So the spectrum of my work ranges from, on the one hand, very clean and effective information designs for organizations or companies, for instance, for reports, or when they publish big data sets to provide visuals that go with that. Over then to high-end custom visualizations that are very tailored to one purpose, very, very specific for one data set, which you see in the middle column. I'll show a few of these. And on the right-hand side, then, I also do experiments, how we can expand our visual vocabulary, or how we can maybe move beyond the screen or paper. And these are sort of more the experimental data art projects I'll be talking about. And I'll present them also in this direction or in this order. So don't be alarmed if you're thinking during the presentation you're becoming crazier and crazier. Actually, it's the projects that become crazier and crazier, so no worries. So I'll start with the clean, informative stuff. So here's some of the work I did for the World Economic Forum. They always do surveys of the most important risks. So what are the biggest risks we are facing today? And they ask experts, for instance, what they think are the most likely and the most impactful risks, and then this becomes aggregated. And you can see here that's a fairly straightforward scatter plot diagram with the likelihood to the right-hand side and the impact on the vertical axis. But what makes it more interesting is that you can now apply different filters and focus on different parts of the graphic, or also rearrange the dots depending on where the respondents came from. So instead of presenting just one worldview, we have a couple of different views and perspectives that are embedded in this one graphic, and users can freely decide which path to take, or which two perspectives to compare and explore. And by making also these very simple and clean graphics interactive, we enable new types of insights and a new type of engagement with the data. It's not something you take for granted. It's something you take as a world you can explore, if you like. More work in this way, or these are now the same risks, but we are interested in how do they play together. So which risks cause which other risks? And you might think of very complex network depictions with lots of lines, like hairball type graphics. What we did here is do something very simple. So you can always put one risk in the center, and you will see that the most connected risks, they come close to that risk, and the less connected ones, they go further away. So we introduce a physical metaphor that's very immediately understandable and it makes a very clean graphic, because we don't need to draw lines or create a big mess. So by using interaction, we can also help relax our graphics and help focus on what's really important. Anyone know this guy? Yeah? No? Yeah. Hans Rosling, he's fantastic. He's like a data storyteller, really, and he has this way, this sports reporter way of narrating and commenting on graphics. And he is like in the middle of explaining a graphic, so he tries to grab these bubbles. And he started the Scapminder software, which is now acquired by Google. It's a fairly, as you can see, a fairly technical tool, but very powerful. So you can compare nations with respect to all kinds of different dimensions. And I was asked to remix one of his graphics like this. He always has these bubble trail graphics where you can see the development over time. And a magazine asked me to remix one of his graphics, which is a funny commission already. And so I came up with this graphic where you can see different countries, how they perform, or how their fertility rate and their life expectancy has changed over the years. And because it's a print graphic, but I wanted to keep some of the dynamism of Hans Rosling as a person, and also his graphics, I used the same idea that we have these sort of worms that flow through space, if you want. And each of these country worms here, so 1980 is here at the end, and the thicker end is 2009, and you really, alone from how the graphic is designed, you can read the temporal trend very easily. You don't actually need to internalize what that all means. You can see immediately where things are moving just by transforming, just by how the visuals are created. And so you can see all the countries moving from towards less fertility rate, higher life expectancy. But you can also see things like Botswana having this big dip in life expectancy due to AIDS in the 1990s. Or you can, for instance, see how Vietnam has caught up with the US in the 80s, more or less. So Vietnam is now at a place where the US was in the 80s. And all these things are not insights that are readily prepared for you, but that you will discover if you sort of dive into that graphic and study it a bit. So these are, in principle, this is a static work, like a print product, but it tries to use some of the ideas from interactive visualization. Now here's a proper interactive one, a project I did for FIFA together with Studio Nantes and Jens Franke and the agency Medienfabrik. And what we set out to is to map all of FIFA's global development work. So FIFA does quite a bit of funding for projects around the world, and teaching and courses, builds infrastructure, and we built a globe for them that would show how many of these projects they do around the world. And you can explore the world by just hopping from country to country, but you can also read a lot of detail info. Once you have a country or confederation selected, you can see exactly how they spend their money, which is quite interesting in some cases, also compared to other countries. You have a big timeline, and it's hundreds and thousands of individual events really that make up this whole application. And again, you can choose the perspective you want. It's mostly an interface for serendipity. So most people just start by randomly hopping around on the globe, but by slowly getting into that world, they acquire a sense of how these projects are like and what they are about. Again, here, reduction is key. So we really focused or tried to make the application focused on these individual events. So we developed our own geometry for that world globe. So we didn't go with a staple like Google Earth or something like this, because there the graphics of the globe would distract far too much from the information we want to depict. Another interactive project, one that was quite successful overall for the OECD, the Better Life Index. It was launched over 2 years ago on the occasion of the 50th birthday of the anniversary of the OECD, and the idea was to have a bit of a different perspective on country rankings, right? So you will always read these country rankings, like Finland is great at that, and Germany is bad at this and that. And the OECD decided to have a bit of a different approach here and put a bit more control also in the hands of the user, or at least say, well, it might depend a bit on from which side you're looking at the problem. And so here's the website, and when you come to the side, you will see there's a lot of flowers, first of all, which is a bit surprising maybe for a statistics website. And so you have a lot of flowers standing for these different countries, and you have a set of topics on the right-hand side, like housing, income, jobs, community, all different things you might be interested in. And now you as a user can say, this is the thing I'm interested in. And this is the thing I most care about, and now let's see which countries perform best. So you can, in the beginning, say, okay, everything's equally important, and the flowers will arrange as if everything would be equally important. If we now prioritize civic engagement, for instance, we can see Australia and Sweden, they rise to the top. Now they are at the top of the ranking. But you might say, well, some income would be nice too. And so if we, let's say, put income in the mix, now Luxembourg and the United States, they sort of gain ground. And depending on how you as a user shift the weights, the ranking of these countries changes. And at the same time, the flower petals, they reflect, on the one hand, your weighting of these topics and these themes. And the length of these flowers stands for the score that country has. You can also look at inequalities, for instance, like gender differences, in which countries is there a bigger difference in how men and women have different opportunities or not. You can have different sorting and ranking options. And it should be mentioned, this is more or less the playful entry point to a big depth of information. So on all the topic pages and the country pages, there's a huge number of individual statistics, lots of hard numbers, and this is sort of the playful launchpad for this type of thing. By now it's implemented in HTML5, so it also runs on tablets. We have different international versions. It has become quite a big enterprise by now. And what I'm most happy about is that it's not just a visualization. It's also a branding and a communication tool in some sense. So these flowers, they have sort of become also an icon, more or less, for the whole initiative, a way of communicating also the ideas of this initiative, also between the lines. And not just communicating numbers, but communicating general concepts and ideas. And I find this combination of, or this idea to use data visualization also as sort of, how it can communicate between the lines. I find this an interesting perspective. So it was used here as, for different booths or brandings, but it was also spotted on murals along the staircases and so on. You might wonder why the flower metaphor and so on. So in fact, we tried a lot of different variations or different ways how we could depict that type of information in the design process. So these are just some of the different design variations we produced. And some of them also made it into interactive prototypes. So the ones that we found most promising, because obviously it was clear that we want to have a lot of countries, we want to compare them in a very interactive way, and it's really important that at all times you can read all these things individually, and you can read the values. And for instance, this one looks good in isolation, but once these things start to overlap, you're losing sort of this coherence. What is one coherent flower? So we sort of ruled it out for these reasons. And in my work, interactive prototyping, or prototyping directly with the data, is a really important component, because it's one thing to think on paper. It might be nice to have a certain visual, but it always turns out a bit different once you fill it with the actual data, and you always develop new ideas based on what you see. So it needs to be an iterative process that leads you to the final solution. And as I said, in this case, it was not just a decision, what is the best data visualization, but also what is the best image, that stands for the whole initiative, that can carry the communication for this whole initiative. So right from the start, we thought about, well, how would it work in a logo if we go into a certain direction? The other thing that's interesting about the project, we are now in a position that we can look back and also say, okay, how often have all these different topics, for instance, been clicked? How important do people think individual topics are? Which countries are they interested in? Which themes are they interested in? So we use this information at all times to go back and improve the site, but also for the OECD, it's an interesting form of understanding what people are interested in. And just a few words on process there, because it fits well in this context. So in my workflow, at the beginning, I always need two types of things from the client. So we need goals and constraints. So we need some type of strategy and some type of playground. Where's the thing going to happen? And what is it about? Why are we doing this? And the other thing I always ask for straight away is data. So you can think up a lot of stuff, but it has to be rooted and grounded in the actual data. And at the same time, the data can be an inspiring material. So once you work with the data, you will have new ideas of what could be done with it. And to me, it's very important in this early stage that understanding what is inside the data and what we learn from the data can feed back into the conceptual considerations, how we orient and position the whole project. And once this sort of looping or ping pong between these two worlds has settled to a stable state, we can move on and then have a more streamlined traditional production pipeline, have a design, produce it, launch it, but then also, of course, analyze, maintain, continue to work with it, and ideally, in a new iteration, go back and do the whole thing over again the way it should be done, because you will only understand once you have launched it once. I must say, the Better Life Index is one of the rare projects where we actually do this extensive workflow. Many of the other projects are just one-offs, and I find it a bit sad, and I often have better ideas once it has been online, and I've seen how people have actually used it, how it should have looked. A few more experimental projects. So this is, actually it's from 2008 already, so time's flying. It was still part of my research activities, and we built an interactive installation at the Venice Biennale. And you can see there are paper cards, and they stand for architectural projects. And they're like trump cards or so, and you can take them. They have a marker on the back. And you can put them on a table, and the table will draw the conceptual relations between these projects. So if they use a certain inspiration, if they have that in common, or they use the same materials, the same algorithms for creating the shape, it will show up on the table. And this is the one thing. So it's interesting to create this sort of magic connection between a digital image and a physical object. but you also create a social situation. So instead of one person looking at one screen, you have a couple of people looking at the same thing. And it sounds, pretty trivial, but this changes how this whole interface is used. And suddenly you start to discuss what you're seeing there. People sort of get into each other's ways. They have to figure out what is polite in this new digital context. There are also funny things, like if you put the same card twice, the digital representation will move from the first card to the second one, so you can sort of steal each other's contents. And by creating this situation, it also changes a lot how the whole visualization, the role it can play, and how it's being perceived. The other interesting thing is if you work with these surfaces, for instance, like tables, there is no up and down anymore, because you can approach the table from any side. On a screen, you have up, down, left, right, and this is what we work with all the time. On such a table, you have center and not center. So you have to think in radial coordinates if you want, polar coordinates. And the other thing I find really interesting is to create this sort of space. So we had like big projections on the walls that would reflect the situation on the table, but provide a bit more media and materials to support that. And I think this is sort of at the heart, of course, of making data tangible, is if you actually go into a physical space and provide physical interfaces for data. Another data art project, actually a commission. So there are data art commissions. This one was for the London 2012 festival, for the Olympic Games. And I was part of a bigger team, so I think there were 10 people involved at times in the project. What we did was, so there were the Olympic Games, of course. Everybody watched them on TV or in the stadium. What we did is capture the social media response. So we looked at how are the events being commented online, mostly Twitter. We're then looking these messages, what can we do with them? Can we, for instance, find out if they were happy messages, cheering messages, or sad messages? So we tried to analyze the emotions contained in the words used, or the emotional tone, let's say, of a message. And we were also looking for individual topics, like different athletes, different disciplines. And then we did a couple of things with that. So we had a real-time data visualization. So during the games, you could see what is the average mood related to the games. We had some sort of data journalistic activities where we looked on interesting stories over the course of a few days. And in the end, we produced a data sculpture that would sort of condense all these 12 million tweets that we collected in one physical object that is also digitally augmented. And I'll focus on this one. And so this was the sculpture we had for each day of the games. So 19 overall, we had a plate. We had it milled, so it's with CNC milling technique. This relief is produced from our digital files. And at the bottom here, you can see, of each plate, you can see the very negative tweets, and the negative emotions towards the top are the positive ones. And the relief of the plates reflects the overall mood change for the games. And the projection overlay, so the blue colors you see is actually a digital projector that highlights how individual topics that you selected as a user have developed over the course of the games. And so if you switch between two topics, you will see that different parts of the sculpture are being highlighted. So there's a video again that makes it maybe a bit clearer. So you had a knob, and you could press the knob to switch through between the different channels, let's say, the different topics, and you could turn it and move a cursor through time, and you could read, for instance, like on day 3 at 12 p.m., what was the most tweeted or retweeted message during that time of the games. And it's sort of funny to, of course, conceptually to preserve something like tweets, something so ephemeral as a Twitter message, or 12 million of them, for that matter, in this physical object that looks like it's going to stay forever. It's like something you put in a salt mine. But we were artistically, of course, exactly after this sort of strange juxtaposition. Yeah, and I mean, fabrication is becoming really cheap. So if you think about 3D printing, I don't think it's absurd to say like that you could maybe in 5 years print your stock market in a little sculpture every morning. It's not that. I mean, each of these plates cost maybe now hundreds of euros, but I mean, these prices are falling, and printing is becoming really cheap. So this whole idea that you can create data sculptures or tangible objects that represent data, it's not very far away. And it leads again to different social situations. It's something you see together. So it's not something you see in private. It's something that is shared, an object is shared, it has a space around it. And it's also fun because it's something you can touch. It has a certain surface, a certain quality in touch to it. And also you can, for instance, mark one point in the sculpture with your finger and remember that, and then feel other points or point to other points. So it also affords new types of interaction. We also did, as I said, more investigations of individual stories. So here you see the developments for topics, for instance, like NBC or Tom Daley, a diver, Michael Phelps. For all these individual persons and topics, we were able to sort of graph the sentiment development, how they were being perceived over the games. And here in these graphics, the thickness of the line stands for the overall amount of messages related to that topic, and the color and the vertical position stands for if it's a positive or a negative comment, right? And so you can see here, for instance, I'll zoom in on this part. So you can see here Tom Daley has this big dip in lots of negative tweets, but in fact that was when he was sort of harassed online, and a lot of that, so that he was sort of mentioned in a very negative context, but it wasn't negative towards him. But then he received a lot of sort of positive feedback that people said like, yeah, we're going to help you and we're going to stand for you. The other thing here, for instance, for Michael Phelps, so this is when he won his sort of one of the big competitions, and in the next morning, Barack Obama congratulated him, and this was sort of the same. It caused the same sort of burst in attention, more or less. The funny thing is, you wouldn't have seen that if you had just looked at the average sentiment, because it's all very positive, but you can see these two blobs of attention because we also plot the volume. So, and by combining these two things, you get these very strong messages. Yeah, also more, like lots of little stories in the data, let's say. So this dip here indicates that awkward moment when Ryan Lochte admits that he's been peeing at the Olympic pool. So that causes a dip of -4 sentiment points. But he quickly recovered, so no worries. Yeah. And going into the data and really looking at why are certain spikes or dips, why did they come about, that has been almost the most interesting part, I would say, of the project. And we tried to document as much as we could. But in the end, we had a software that would graph these things and would also allow us to go into these points and say, like, why, what were the tweets that caused that dip? And it's a very fascinating activity. Last type of project, as I said, at some point you'll think I'm losing it, but this is the last one. So, data cuisine. So, we had sculptures, not enough. Now we're looking at how can we use food for data expression and data representation. And it's just a question we started with, so we didn't know where this would end. But I teamed up with Susanne Jaschko. She's been organizing the whole activity mostly. Antti Nurka, he's a great chef. Nathalie Aubrey, she did the organization. And Misha is a open data expert. And together we organized a workshop in Helsinki on 2 days, and we had 15 people. And together we explored this notion of, okay, how can we express local data in local food and create sort of edible diagrams, if you want. But not just paint with food, but really use everything that food has to offer, like temperature, taste, crunch, plating, all these things you can work with in food. And what can we do with that to express information? And so the way the workshop went, each participant brought like one ingredient that is close to their heart and had sort of an interesting story for them or carried some meaning for them. And the first day was mostly about brainstorming, coming up with ideas, trying to combine different ingredients with topics and associations, and sort of develop a recipe, or at least a direction of where you were going. And the second day is all about, of course, cooking. And so here's somebody making his custom lasagna dough, different sauces being prepared. So the chef was really helpful in helping us with all the techniques and all the different things you can do. And so I'll show you some of the results. So this one is called kippis. Kippis means cheers in Finnish. And it's a map of Finland. So on the right-hand side, it's made from typical food for all the different regions. And the filling of the glasses indicates how much alcohol they drink in the different regions per person. It's also different types of alcohol, so is it more wine or beer or schnapps? And it's sort of a diagram of the alcohol consumption, if you want. The lasagna, you might remember the dough. So this one is a portrait of the ethnic mix in Helsinki. And the left-hand side is the 1980s. And the right-hand side is 2010. And so in the 1980s, there were not many foreigners, or it was mostly Finnish people in Helsinki. But over the years, much more different nationalities moved in. And so throughout that lasagna, the spice mix really gets, it gets spicier and spicier because for each nation that comes in, a new type of spice is introduced. And so you can taste your way through time and really taste how the ethnic mix of Helsinki has changed. Happiness cocktail, that's a nice one too. So that's... it's a shrimp cocktail, and the idea is to have like a cocktail party, and everybody gets one of these glasses. And the number of rice grains indicates the number of your Facebook friends, and the number of shrimp indicates how many of these are smiling on their profile pictures. So if you see somebody with a well-filled glass, lots of shrimp, he has happy friends, and lots of them, and so I might talk to him. Yeah. And in the end, all of this was documented in recipes. So for us, it was important, this sort of playful aspect, of course, and this sort of, thinking outside of usual categories, but also being rigorous at the same time. So people had to be really clear about, well, how do you get from data to the dish, and what are the ingredients, and what are the mechanisms that stand for or represent certain aspects of the data. And of course, always nice in these types of contexts, the connection between the people and what they came up with. And I haven't shown the right one. So that's a Russian guy, and he came up with this crime salad type thing, showing different crimes in Moscow and different layers of his salad. Yeah. So if you're interested, results are up at datacuisine.net. And we try to do this workshop 2, 3, 4 more times just to explore a bit more, okay, how's that space and how can we work with it? What can be done in that space? So just to sum up, I guess you have seen a wide range of stuff if you think like over the course of this presentation. In the end, whatever I do, for me, information design or good information design is always a combination of the arts and the sciences, if you want, or of the worlds of information and the world of design and the abstract and the central. So it's a lot about marrying two things that usually don't go together. But that's also the exciting part about it. And one thing that's recurring in my work and that I find more and more important to consider is this idea that we don't present ready-made facts, but we enable learning through playful exploration, really. So instead of saying, this is how the world looks, provide space for interaction and just see what happens. Be a bit open about what's happening in the end. Yeah. And in that spirit, I could watch that forever, but just a few messages maybe in this context. So a few things I learned also is, so good visualization shows the data, of course. That's sort of the baseline. This is what you want to see. But you know what? Great visualizations, they show you the patterns in the data. They don't stop at just presenting, this is the actual Excel sheet I received. They try to carve out what is really interesting about the data set and what is the underlying structure, what is the skeleton behind it, more or less. Good visualizations, of course, answer your question, help you fulfill your tasks in a better way. Great visualizations actually generate new questions. So they make you see the world in a whole new way. And they might even stir up your worldview a bit and hopefully have you go out and research on your own if what you have seen in the visualization is true, or how it, if you find other examples of a similar kind. things like that. And of course, you will also hear quite a bit that, of course, good visualizations tell a story. Storytelling is the thing of the day. To me, great visualizations, they actually tell 1,000 stories. They don't just stop at one story. They tell 1,000. But of course, the key is not to tell them all at once, right? So it sounds very easy, but that's actually the hard part. And yeah, with that, I'll say thanks for listening so far, and I'm up for questions. Thank you.